When you get a letter of intent of a buyer to buy your Amazon FBA business, what are the things that you should make sure that this letter actually covers? It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be buying your Amazon FBA business. There are some things that you need to make sure are there to actually protect yourself. So that's what I'm going to be covering in this video. Hit a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel to learn more about building, growing, and selling an Amazon FBA business for 7-figure exit. Today, let's talk about letter of intent. Let's talk about letter of intent. So 9 questions to answer before signing an LOI to sell your Amazon FBA business. So letter of intent is something that is signed between, usually when you are buying a business, and it's not only about regarding Amazon, but when you're basically selling your Amazon FBA business, then this is a document that basically starts the negotiation phase. So it's really super important that we not only know what it is, but also need to know what it needs to cover. So that's why I'm presenting like these 9 questions that we need to ask ourselves before signing this, to make sure that we don't end up in a situation that is not really ideal for us. So what it is, it can offer both the buyer and the seller important protections. So it's not about either party, it's just basically about both parties. But the important thing is that, okay, who made this LOI? Typically it's the buyer that's going to be offering it. But the thing is that, it's made from their standpoint, and if we are not careful, if there actually might be some things that are not good for us as the seller. So let's go through at least some of the things that it needs to cover. But anyway, just a quick general description. What is an LOI? So it's basically this document outlining the understanding between 2 or more parties which they intend to formalize in a legal binding agreement. So this means that this is not a legally binding document in its entirety. What is basically written there, it's not, you cannot take it as like cast in stone. So that's why we need to be really, really sure what we are doing before we sign the document. And basically, as mentioned, like if it's carefully done, then it's just protection for both parties. And here is actually an example that, let's say a seller of business may incorporate what is known as this non-solicitation provision, which means that you restrict the buyer's ability to hire people from the seller's business if the parties actually decide that we are not going to be closing this transaction. So we're not actually going to go through this deal. And then again, for the buyer, it gives this protection that it can give this protection that by expressly conditioning its obligation to complete the transaction if it is unable to secure financing for the transaction. So that's like actually an important thing to note there. Let's say that the buyer doesn't even have finances to go through with the deal. They can still they can still actually sign an LOI, which basically holds the seller for a certain period, even though the buyer actually does not have finances. So yeah, before signing, it's important that we are careful. And what is usually included? There's just so many different things, and these are basically applicable to most businesses, I mean, not only Amazon FBA business, but other general types. So it's about different kind of conditions to closing the deal, this allocation of different kinds of fees and expenses. I mean, related with the deal itself. Then this anticipated time frame, due diligence process, confidentiality, not only regarding the sale, but this due diligence process as well. Then non-solicitation, so the buyer is prevented from soliciting the employees or customers or whatever. And the closing date, exclusivity, indemnification terms, governing law, and then definition of the binding and non-binding LOI provisions and termination date and stuff like this. But I mean, that kind of stuff is applicable to other businesses as well as just Amazon FBA. But let's just focus on selling an Amazon FBA business. So one of the key things is that there are many aggregators. If there are many players in the field, then it probably means that there's likely to be some unethical ones too. I mean, because this is a gold rush right now. What's happening? Like, was it last figure was something like over $12 billion has been raised to buy businesses in this field. So it's just like hundreds of these aggregators that are buying businesses. I mean, it's pretty likely that there's some unethical ones too. And I have heard from some cases where the buyer has done some unethical actions, and here it's actually good to point out that it doesn't necessarily mean that the buyer is unethical, but I mean, they're using some unethical tactics, or some people in their teams are doing some unethical things. And it just might be that they are cutting corners, or they are just maybe they are sloppy, and that's why they are actually doing these things. I mean, who knows? I mean, there might be tons of different reasons why they actually do this. But the bottom line is that in order to prevent us from unethical actions, then we need to do some safety measure. I don't think there's any players in the market thinking that, yeah, I'm just gonna like mess up with all these different sellers. No, it's probably be usually a condition where that, okay, they just cut corners or do something without really thinking too much about it. Anyway, so we need to make sure at least these 9 questions are answered. So I said that I'm going to be defining 9 questions. So let's go there. But actually before that, most importantly, ask yourself, why would a buyer offer this letter of intent if they have no plans to go through with the deal? I mean, it wouldn't really make sense, right? Actually, this is an important thing. Like before we even sign this LOI, I mean, we need to make sure that it's not only one party, or it's not only a few or one employee offering this LOI, because I mean, it might happen because as I mentioned, it's not really that binding. So we need to make sure that all decision makers from the buyer's side have agreed to buy your business. So imagine that you sign an LOI and start this negotiating thing with the buyer, and then basically they said, actually our senior member just said that no, they don't want us to buy your business. Oops. So that's why we need to make sure about the approval process on the buyer's side. Anyway, so here are some examples of negotiating in bad faith. So basically, I mean, first of all, I mean, maybe they have no intention to close the deal. Instead, the seller is simply looking information that will be made available through the due diligence process. Or then changing these major terms to your favor without discovery, resulting in a compelling reason to do so. So this act of bad faith usually happens towards the end of negotiations or at the last minute. Then just disregard for the due diligence process by either party. And if you remember some, I don't know, maybe it's in some of the previous coaching calls, I was talking about what had happened is that there was a deal, and the LOI mentioned some specific things, but actually the buyer later on backed out of those things. I mean, the deal ended up going through, but they basically started arguing about the valuation and expenses and that kind of thing. But anyway, so let's ask this first question, most important question first, like why would an unethical buyer sign LOI? So one reason is that after you sign an LOI, I mean, the seller's income can be, in certain cases, added to look like the buyer's income in bookkeeping. So, I mean, it means that, I mean, on paper, this aggregator can look like growing just by signing LOIs. Let's say that it does 0 deals whatsoever. So the only thing it's doing is just signing these LOIs. Then, I mean, on paper, it looks like it's growing like crazy. And yeah, I mean, as we already mentioned, signing does not mean the buyer will necessarily buy the business. But however, it does mean usually this exclusivity on seller's part during the predefined period. So what does this mean? It means that if we as the seller sign this LOI, then during a certain period, we are not allowed, I mean, after that moment, we are not allowed to talk to other buyers anymore for a certain period of time. So that's why we need to be careful, like when we actually sign this letter. So question number 2 is, how is the SDE calculated? So the seller's discretionary earnings. And so what is included in this seller's discretionary earnings, and why is this important? Because it has a huge impact in our valuation. Like if you remember the formula that is used for evaluating FBA businesses, then it's usually the SDE times the multiple. But the SDD, I mean, that's not the figure that we are going to be getting quite so easily from our reports, because if you remember, then the SDE is calculated. I mean, it's not only net profit; it's basically added. We add those expenses back that the buyer actually is not going to be paying. Has no need to keep paying for. And it can get really complicated. I mean, it's actually much more complicated than that. I mean, it sounds simple in theory, like just saying that, yeah, I mean, it's just expenses that the buyer doesn't need to keep paying once the transaction has gone through. But there are many kind of like gray areas in this thing, meaning that, well, is this like a one-time expense or so on? And the thing is that it also depends on the buyer. So some buyers might accept different expenses that another buyer would not accept. So yeah, so that's basically why we need to have this line items SDE calculation. So we just need to know that how are we going to be calculating this figure here, so we are able to do the evaluation. And this is a really important part, so that there is actually no surprise expenses added by the buyer to decrease valuation. So it's not just about expenses from the seller, but the expenses by the buyer. I mean, if they get this SDE lower, then it will have significant impact, and it might mean that instead of I mean, it can easily be difference of hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it doesn't even need to be that big of a business in order to have that kind of impact on the valuation. So yes, so question number 3 is then, what kind of deal type are we doing? So what is a deal type? Is it asset or stock deal? And most of the time it's just buying these assets. So that's one of the reasons why most of these aggregators don't really care like where your legal entity is. Like, is it in Finland, Estonia, UK, US? If they're only buying the asset, then the legal entity doesn't matter, because what we are basically going to be transferring is the seller central account, the trademark, the inventory, and that kind of stuff. So usually it's much like lower risk, and it's a much faster process, because I mean, imagine like if you buy a legal entity, then you will be held responsible for everything that has happened in the past. But when you're actually buying these assets of the company, like this brand, this product listing, everything related with Amazon and the supplier contracts and that kind of stuff, then you only need to be worried about those things and not any kind of things that the legal entity might have done in the past. And if you watch this video, this interview webinar I did with our student Jonne, I mean, he's part of this company, part of this aggregator company called eBrands. So, and they, I don't know what's their latest figure, but I mean, at that point, he has already done like 20 acquisitions. And if you remember, he was basically saying that, I mean, they're mostly just doing asset deals. Sometimes they do these or stock deals when there's some specific benefit in doing that, and typically it's going to be like tax benefits, for example with the UK. And it was a similar case with Jonne. I mean, they did one of those deals as they're buying the whole legal entity because there were some tax benefits regarding UK. Then question number 4, what we need to be making sure that is part of the L or I. So what happens to the account balance? So I mean, there is really no such period on the seller central account that the balance would be 0. I mean, if you're making sales every day, if you're actually actively making like profit every single day, income every single day, then I mean, there's always balance on seller central account, because as soon as the payout is sent to the bank account, I mean, already like after that time, like depending on your sales volume, it's going to be like few minutes or hours or whatever days like that the account balance has already been accumulated. So that means that we have a question that, okay, what happens to the Amazon account balance once the deal is signed? So which party owns it? If we sign today, then who owns this balance that has been accumulated there? So typically it's going to be the seller. And that just means that the buyer is going to be reimbursing the amount at closing. So once we close the deal, then whatever is there, it's going to be like transferred to the, I mean, it will be paid out to the buyer, but then it's just going to be reimbursed at closing. Then, which TTM? TTM stands for trailing 12 months. So which 12 months are we going to be used to calculate the SDE? So as we discussed before, I mean, for the valuation, we are, or for the SDE, we are going to be using this annual net profit. But the question is that it is not necessarily the fiscal year. It's not necessarily from like January to December. So if we sign a deal, then which 12 months are we going to be using? And as a seller, I mean, it can have a like big impact, especially if you have like fluctuation and seasonality and those kind of things. I mean, and typically, I mean, the highest peak is during the last quarter, so October, November, December. But I mean, depends on many different products, like what are the best months for the business. So yeah, I mean, how are we going to be counting this 12 months? Is it when the offer was made? Or is it last year, like fiscal year? Or is it last 12 months? So if today is March, then is it going to be like 12 months back from this date? So what is the period that we are going to be using in order to calculate the valuation? Then next question. What about the inventory? So how is inventory valued? So once you sell your business, then the inventory itself is not part of the valuation. No, you have some kind of valuation for your business, but then additionally, the buyer is going to be buying the inventory. But then it's a question of like, okay, how is it calculated? How is it really valued? Is it this purchase cost, like what was actually paid for the supplier, or is it landed cost, which can be a bit higher, or what is the specific way that we are getting this number, like how much the inventory is? And here's a kicker. Here's a good thing to understand. I mean, on Amazon, we never want to have too much inventory there because, I mean, after 6 months, typically need to be paying for these long-term storage fees. And another issue past pretty much like since last year, where there's different like inventory limits that Amazon introduced, meaning that if we have like too much inventory on Amazon for certain units, then that means that we are not actually be able to send more there. So we might end up in a situation where we actually need to pull out inventory because for some reason we have too much there. So maybe we send too much inventory to Amazon, or maybe we just maybe the sales just start decreasing or whatever. So it really depends on the aggregators, but it might be that some aggregators will say that, okay, I mean, if it's longer than 180 days or even just 150 days, I mean, it might be considered too old to pay for it, specifically if it is in the fulfillment center. Because if it's in the fulfillment center, then that impacts what we are able to send. And we might actually have like wrong units there. I mean, wrong SKUs there, which means that we want to send the product A there, but I mean, product B is taking all the inventory limits. So we actually need to take some units from product B away in order to send more of product A. So I mean, this can have a pretty big impact. I mean, just consider that, okay, if it's only like 150 days that that the inventory is valued, like older than that will not be paid for. I mean, that can result in pretty significant amount. Then question number 7 is, what is the exclusivity length? So I mean, we already established that there are certain exclusivity that happens immediately after putting your name on the paper, after signing the document. So what is this length? Because it means that if the deal falls through, then I mean, how long do you need to wait until you can talk to other buyers? So that's something that needs to be defined in the LOI, and typically it can be like 1 month to 2 months. I mean, that's what we should like basically list there. I mean, but just imagine that we haven't really specified there, and it's something like 6 months. Then that's pretty long time. Like if you want to sell our business today, and we are discussing with some of the buyers, and then we want to proceed with one of them and sign the deal. But then if it doesn't go through, then imagine that, oh man, we need to wait for 6 months until we sell for talk with any other buyer. So that's why it needs to be there. Then question number 8, are they operating expenses from the buyer? I mean, not from the seller, but from the buyer. What are the key question really is like, what are the expenses to run the business? Because it might be that the buyer will actually try to add expenses to the deal. So it's not just about that we have on our business certain operational expenses that are required in order to maintain business, but it might be that the buyer would add new ones there. So I mean, these will definitely decrease the valuation. So at maximum, it should be like this 4% of revenue. But I mean, ideally, if that's going to happen, we want it to be, I mean, as small number as possible, right? So what it means that they are going to be actually decreasing like this percentage of revenue from the valuation, or from the basically money that they are going to be paying after buying the business. So I mean, just imagine like if your valuation is $1 million, and I mean, it hasn't been defined there, and they suddenly are saying that, yeah, it's gonna be like 10% of the revenue to keep running this business. Then, oops, you just lost like $100,000. So that's not so cool, is it? So that's why we need to define it already on this LOI. The last question is that what accounting method is actually used. So I mean, if we don't even consider the whole world, let's just consider the US. But I mean, even in US, there's just many different methods how to do this accounting. So I mean, how is the accounting handled? If it's this GAAP, this generally accepted accounting principle, I mean, that might be just way overkill for Amazon FBA business, because in the sense it's much more simple than many of the like traditional businesses. So I mean, we just want to keep this accounting as simple as possible. And the thing is that if we don't do this, and they start saying, the buyer says that, yeah, I mean, we are going to be using this method of accounting, and it might mean that, oh Jesus, I mean, we are going to be doing some heavy effort on that side. And even worse, it might be that some of the things that we have there might actually impact the profitability. So maybe it's counted a bit different, and then boom, whoops, suddenly the valuation goes lower. So I mean, the simpler the better, but the thing is that we need to know this in advance before signing the LOI. So we want it to be there to cover to basically lower the risk. And yeah, I mean, it's just best to use this like MA lawyer, so mergers and acquisitions lawyer that has experience on Amazon FBA. So not just any kind of lawyer or not just any kind of MA lawyer, but a lawyer that has done some of these deals and has previously read through these LOIs. So we want that kind of person to actually go through the LOI before we sign the deal. So that's probably one of the most important things. We need to know that we are signing, right? So yeah, well, that pretty much covers, I mean, sure, there's many things that we need to consider, but if I have to define like 9 things right away, I mean, it would be these things. Hit a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you like this topic. Make sure to join my free Facebook group where you get an exit checklist regarding selling your Amazon business. See you there.